Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone. My name is Surya Moon. I co-direct the Global Health Center here in Geneva. I'm joining you all from a gray, cloudy day in Geneva this morning. I'll give you all just a few seconds to get settled in before we dive into our program for today. Okay, wonderful. As I said before, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's my great honor and pleasure to welcome all of you for today's webinar on the COVID-19 vaccine, COVID-19 and a people's vaccine, which has been organized and is hosted by Médecins Sans Frontières Korea. I am the co-director of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. It is really a terrific honor to be here with such a star-studded cast of speakers that we have for you today to discuss, I think, one of the most important and difficult and complex issues on the global agenda in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll offer just a few introductory remarks before we dive in, but before I do, I just wanted to clarify for everyone the housekeeping rules and the logistics for how we will proceed today. We'll be running for 75 minutes. This webinar will be taking place entirely in English, but there is simultaneous translation in Korean being offered. You can just look at the bottom of your screen. There's a little button called interpretation. If you leave it off, you'll continue to hear the program in English. Of course, you can also switch to Korean. We welcome questions from all participants at any time. You can type those into the chat function in the bottom. You can type those in English, or if you would prefer to type those in Korean, you can type those in Korean, and we will have one of our colleagues from MSF Korea who will also translate them into English for you. Let me give you a brief overview for how we will proceed this morning. After some opening remarks, just to set the stage in terms of the topic for today, I will give the floor to Mr. Thierry Coppens, who's the Director General of MSF Korea. He will be followed by a keynote presentation from Dr. Manuel Martin from MSF, the MSF Access to Essential Medicines campaign. And then we'll move after that to our illustrious panel, where we have a really amazing lineup of experts from Korea and around the world, including Professor Sun-Man Kwan, Ambassador Sang-Bum Lim, Dr. Jerome Kim, and Dr. Jin-Won Yoon, each of whom I will introduce in a little bit more detail in just a minute. After our panel and a quick round of Q&A, we'll open up for any questions or comments from the floor before we close by 10:15 local time here in Geneva. So let me introduce a little bit of the subject for today. I think, as I mentioned before, the question of whether a COVID-19 vaccine can be developed that is safe and effective, as I think foremost on everybody's mind. Of course, a vaccine will not be a silver bullet, but it is certainly hoped to be a game changer, a potential game changer that can help countries to restart their economies, to restart normal social activity, and to get life back to something close to normal. As a result, a COVID-19 vaccine is certainly seen as a strategic asset, not like any other medical product. As a strategic asset, we have seen that there is what many media outlets have called a race to see who will cross the finish line first. But I think even more important than which company or which country gets the first COVID-19 vaccine is, of course, who will get access. How many people, how many countries around the world will, in fact, be able to access these important medical technologies? We heard back in May from South Korea's President Moon Jae-in that Korea, in fact, commits itself to making any COVID-19 vaccine a global public good. In essence, a global public good means that everybody is able to get access to the product. But a number of questions have come up in the months since then, in the 5 months since then. In particular, how many vaccines can the world produce? Which countries will get access to those vaccines? When and who are the individuals within these countries who will get access as a priority? And finally, will these vaccines cost? There has been quite a lot of focus in the global media on what's happening among the big multinational firms in the United States and Europe, and also in China and Russia, who will win the vaccine race among all of these different regions of the world. There has been, I would argue, relatively less understanding of what has been happening in the Republic of Korea, in South Korea. It's less well understood. But I think there are very important political, scientific, and industrial angles to the question of vaccine access, and important contributions that can and hopefully will be made by Korean stakeholders. South Korea has been a clear positive example for the world in terms of its response to this outbreak, and is referred to repeatedly in policy debates worldwide for its success in bringing the pandemic under control without some of the devastating consequences we've seen in many other countries. We can see that the contributions of the country may not only be in the area of outbreak preparedness and response, but also, as I mentioned, on an industrial, scientific, and a political level. For example, we have in Korea, the International Vaccine Institute, which was established in 1997 as the first intergovernmental organization based in Korea. And we have today the Director General from IVI, Dr. Jerome Kim, the Director General who has joined us, who is an accomplished scientist who recently retired from a long and storied career in the US Army, is a medical doctor and a scientist, and will be sharing some of his insights on the work of the IVI. We have also in Korea a recent transition from a primarily generics focused pharmaceutical industry into one that has heavily and deeply embraced research and development and innovation. And we've seen that the Korean government has taken a very strong stance in supporting innovation in the country, including investing about $2 billion per year in public money in R&D, and most recently announcing $120 million of further public investment in research and development of drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics, and manufacturing of medical products in the country. So we're really delighted to have with us today Dr. Jinwon Yoon, who is the Vice President of Genexine, which is one of the leading companies developing a COVID-19 vaccine candidate, the furthest advanced candidate in Korea, who is an immunologist by training and has a long and very accomplished career in the pharmaceutical industry. We also have, of course, the government playing an important role at the international level, politically, with the recent establishment, for example, of the G4 IDR group, the support group for global infectious disease response, which includes not only the Republic of Korea, but also Kenya, Morocco, Peru, Singapore, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. And so we're very delighted to have with us Ambassador Sangbum Lim from the permanent mission of South Korea to the UN here in Geneva, who has a very accomplished career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and most recently was in charge of non-proliferation and disarmament. We've seen the engagement of Korea at the international level increasing in global health in general, not only in research and development, but also, of course, it has joined the COVAX facility. It has increased its contributions to the Gavi Alliance. It is a board member of UNITAID. It is a contributor to CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and has also established the Right Fund. So we see a really a flowering and a proliferation of engagement with international initiatives on health. Last but not least, we have, of course, a deep expertise, a very strong public health system in Korea, as I said, that has become the envy of the world. And we're really delighted that we have Professor Sun-Man Kwon, who is with us today, who is also the former dean of the School of Public Health at Seoul National University, a health economist, and a widely respected and well-known international expert on public health matters. All of this has also drawn Korea, I think, more closely into international civil society networks, and certainly not least of which is Médecins Sans Frontières, which has been, of course, for more than 40 years now at the forefront of humanitarian action, but also advocating for the last 20 years very strongly to improve access to medical tools and technologies. And so it's my great pleasure now to give the floor to Mr. Thierry Coppens, who has worked for 20 years in humanitarian assistance, most recently in Lebanon, assisting Syrian and Palestinian refugees before taking the helm of MSF Korea. Thierry, over to you.
Thank you, Suri. Distinguished guests, and good afternoon, good morning. It's really an honor for Médecins Sans Frontières Korea to host this webinar on COVID-19 and people's vaccines with the participation across different parts of the world. As you mentioned, Suri, in 1999, when MSF won the Nobel Peace Prize, we put the funds of the awards towards improving treatments and boosting research for neglected disease. Ever since, MSF has been addressing the unavailability, unsuitability, and unaffordability also of medical tools in the context where we work. Although we have registered significant progress, there is still, unfortunately, a long way to ensure that patients, especially from low and middle income countries, have access to quality, affordable diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines. In our daily practice, MSF teams in the field are frustrated by the lack of effective and affordable tools available in our operation and for patients we treat. The COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated the situation. Nowadays, we find the issue of access at the center also of political debates, including in high-income countries. The unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic, which has impacted the entire world, is a crisis where the issue of access and solidarity is more evident than ever. There is still continuing difficulties for a vast number of people around the world to access affordable diagnostics. Some key treatments are monopolized by the interests of a few private companies and nationalism. And vaccines that are still under development are already hoarded by a few powerful countries, as you mentioned previously. Also, the rush to create a COVID-19 vaccines combined with a political incentive may compromise rigorous and proper assessments of vaccine safety and effectiveness, putting world at the risk of suboptimal vaccines, which may in fact do more harm than good. It is in these challenging times that we need a stronger call to solidarity. This pandemic will not be over until it is over for everyone. The failure of solidarity will result in the loss of many more lives. The disconnection from so many activities we once took for granted, the risk of future generations losing the opportunity also to be educated properly, and the exacerbating social and political tension disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable and the prolonged downturn of the global economy. From the beginning of the pandemic, Korea has been in the forefront of addressing the need for solidarity from the highest level. Through today's webinar, I hope we will be able to have a productive discussion on what Korea and other countries alike can do to support global mechanism, and also on what researchers and companies can do to jointly to consolidate this effort. I, of course, appreciate all the speakers for being part of the discussion and everyone who took time of your busy schedule to attend this webinar. And I will take also the opportunity for a special thanks to Shineha, our external advisor, who made this webinar possible and who has initiated also this webinar. I hope sincerely that today's discussion will be meaningful to you and to all of us who is participating in this webinar. So thank you very much, and I wish you a fruitful discussion.
I can't believe I'm still forgetting to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Thierry. Let me give the floor now to Dr. Manuel Martin from the MSF Access Campaign. He is a medical doctor. He is the Innovation and Access Policy Advisor for the Access Campaign, and he is probably the human being who has been following the access issues on a COVID-19 vaccine. I would say one of the handful of human beings that's been following this issue most closely over the last 10 months, building on his previous work, focusing on the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and in particular, the access policies of CEPI. So Manuel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Suri. And I'm glad you said one of the people, not the person, because I can think of a few others who are following this very closely as well. Let me just get this presentation started. I'll try not to repeat some of the remarks that Terry has already made, which I thought set the stage very well. But just to emphasize the fact that MSF has a lot of experience in working with epidemics, notably, and I'll come to that a bit later, we were one of the main responders to the 2014-2016 Ebola outbreak, and which is really an inflection point for the kind of expectations that we have of the business as usual pharmaceutical research and development model. So far in COVID-19, we have seen more or less 40,000 patient visits and various different projects that we have, all related to COVID. And I want to go back to the point that Terry made around the Nobel Peace Prize in 1999, which really highlighted the three issues we saw around access, which were unaffordability, unavailability, and unsuitability of the different treatment tools, in particular for neglected tropical diseases, which was really the one area where we had seen a clear market failure. And in the 20 years of the existence of the Access campaign, this has become a recurring theme. So initially identified primarily for neglected tropical diseases and also neglected patients, this market failure has appeared in a number of different areas since then. We have encountered unsuitable vaccines, unsuitable diagnostic tools, HIV medicines that weren't suited for especially pediatric patients, because the majority of pediatric HIV patients is are in developing countries and don't represent a significant enough market for a purely profit-driven research and development system to really incentivize research and development into developing even just new formulations. And more recently, just before COVID-19, we saw a very significant publicity. It existed already for a while, but publicity around the market failure in the space of not only drug-resistant TB, but also AMR more generally, so antimicrobial resistance. There haven't been any really new antimicrobial classes developed for the last 40 years. And now slowly there's that recognition that that will come to bite us in the future. And we have to really invest and look at different models and different ways of investing to research and development that incentivize public interest research and development. A true inflection point, I believe, for this analysis was the 2014-2016 Ebola outbreak, where I already said MSF was one of the main responders. One of our healthcare workers described responding to the outbreak as fighting a forest fire with spray bottles. This was a disease that had been known for 40 years almost. And there had been recurring outbreaks since then. And there actually had been a vaccine that had been developed, but it sat on a shelf for a very long time and wasn't developed. And only the very first clinical trial of that vaccine was started at the beginning of that outbreak. And that was very frustrating, obviously, because to us, because we didn't have any adequate tools, even though we had known about this disease for a very long time, but also because it just, again, re-highlighted yet another area where the current research and development model that was primarily driven by the profit motive was inadequate and didn't respond to the most urgent public health needs. And it was in the wake of this outbreak that the organization, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, CEPI, was actually created to start investing into developing vaccine platforms, in particular against emerging infectious diseases, such as Nipah, Lassa virus. They also financed some of the clinical trials in the more recent outbreak in the DRC, and really developed a number of the platforms that are now continuing to be developed for COVID-19 vaccines. But all of that is just to say that I think that really clearly illustrates the limits of the purely profit-driven research and development system that we're currently working under, and that it often fails to respond, especially to urgent public health needs, where not a clear market is visible. In COVID-19, I think we have seen some of the same dynamics repeated. Having said that, I think that there is definitely a growing recognition that the business as usual models don't work and aren't suitable to a growing number of global health challenges, expanding from neglected tropical diseases to AMR to emerging infectious diseases, etc. And what we have seen during COVID is really an unprecedented level of public and philanthropic involvement and funds as well throughout the R&D value chain, going beyond also traditionally where the majority of the public and philanthropic money has been invested in was in early and preclinical research. Also a little bit in clinical research, but now that really has been supercharged during COVID, where we see a lot of public and philanthropic involvement throughout clinical trials and even the scale up of manufacture. We've also seen new initiatives set up to deal with the very most urgent short-term needs. They get a lot of media attention. We have obviously the COVAX pillar of the ACT Accelerator, which is hosted by CEPI and Gavi. Which really aims to get some of the very first successful vaccines somehow distributed in an equitable way. I think one important thing to mention, however, that this is really an emergency measure. It is really for the first batches. And the COVAX mechanism, as it currently stands, aims to vaccinate of the participating countries somewhere between 10 and 50% of their populations, depending on whether these are self-financing countries or countries that will be given donor assistance, and also depending on which models countries have subscribed to the COVAX through. But it will not provide vaccinations for 100% of the population, and it is unlikely that we will even have enough vaccines by the end of 2021 to cover that need. And as Thierry already said, there is no way that this is going to end unless this pandemic really ends for everyone. We need everyone to have access to a vaccine. And with this, I think as the dust of this emergency response settles and the new reality sets in, we should place our gaze a little bit further into the future and begin to shift the focus from primarily around speed and the race to successful vaccine to things like access, affordability, openness, and transparency. All important building blocks to build an R&D ecosystem that really truly prioritizes public health objectives and helps address some of the key challenges related to COVID-19 vaccine access, which I would classify as one being around safety and efficacy. Indeed, a vaccine that is ineffective, maybe worse than no vaccine at all. Then about manufacturing scale up, I've already said it. There's currently no one company that is able to produce enough vaccines for everyone in the world. And also, even if we have several vaccines, we will still need significant scale up in geographically diverse locations. Then thirdly, what has been termed vaccine nationalism, a term describing the increasing number of bilateral deals that a number of countries are signing with developers and manufacturers to obtain access to a certain number of vaccines within their own borders. And then the suitability of vaccines for low resource settings. We have a number of vaccine candidates that are very far in clinical trials that have very difficult supply chains that involve ultra cold storage, sometimes going up to -70 degrees Celsius, which is really difficult already in high income countries with excellent logistics and transport chains and cold chains that can be built up, but even more of a challenge in low resource settings. It was very difficult already with the Ebola vaccine, which is also required significant cold chain to get this to patients, and that really limited access. And then the last point, and I think this is one that we talk about very often, is the issue of affordability. We've seen a very large range in price estimates across the different vaccine candidates, a number of different prices being announced, anywhere between $3 per vaccine all the way to sometimes even above $100 for a course. So I just wanted to re-highlight also what I felt were some very clear and groundbreaking remarks made by President Moon Jae-in at this year's World Health Assembly, where he said that in order to develop vaccines and treatments, we must cooperate beyond our borders. And such vaccines and treatments are public good that must be distributed equitably. And to me, this is a very strong message, a very strong policy objective that requires, also demands some questions about how to implement this practically. And personally, given South Korea's very strong history of purpose-driven industrial strategy, creating very successful large mega companies such as Hyundai and LG, sometimes using both carrots and to achieve that goal, to make those companies into what they are. I think that similar spirit could be employed to try and improve accessibility of future COVID vaccines. And before I end, I just wanted to present just a few what I think are options one could essentially use to improve each one of these different elements of vaccine access. This is obviously a non-exhaustive list. I think a real list would go much, much longer than this, but it's just to stimulate some thought. So I think around safety and efficacy, one really important thing, and I think this is probably where we have seen the most progress in relation to what the business as usual model looks like, is around the transparency of clinical trial data. We've seen a number of companies be very open, share their clinical trial protocols, something that we think should be the norm, but it is nonetheless laudable that companies are doing this. It provides a lot of, I think, trust also to the public in the process of vaccine research and development and the clinical trials. Then also the use of, and an important aspect, I think, of safety and efficacy is also determining what the relative efficacy of vaccines is amongst one another. And there's two steps to that. The first one is analyzing a lot of the biomarkers is tricky because different labs use slightly different assays to measure the same biomarkers. So even though we have data from phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials for a number of the vaccine candidates, they aren't really comparable across the different vaccine candidates. And that is really something that the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, why they set up a centralized laboratory network to be able to standardize some of these assays. And then this is a big question mark, is around COVID-19 vaccine solidarity trial. I think the solidarity trial that the WHO has been leading around treatments, there has been really a great success in being able to compare different treatments against one another and identify which ones are truly the most promising ones. And this is, one could imagine something similar happening for COVID vaccines. Then in terms of manufacturing scale up and scaling out of capacity, one important point we think is the open sharing, not only of intellectual property, which is necessary but not sufficient, but also know-how and data related to vaccine production. Technology transfer is a process that can involve anything from a very simple sharing of just know-how to very active process and involvement of companies sending over staff to train manufacturers elsewhere in the world to be able to produce their vaccines, the vaccines that they developed. And this will obviously also require some large-scale and at-risk investment into geographically diverse manufacturing facilities, which will have benefits also going beyond COVID, potentially in being able to produce vaccines should the next pandemic roll around. And really a key aspect of that would also be the transparency around licensing terms, because it helps accelerate that process. Then I think to tackle vaccine nationalism, certainly the equitable allocation of already existing vaccines is important. And as they are produced, even we believe a percentage of the vaccines obtained through bilateral deals should be funneled through global solidarity mechanisms. Potentially the COVAX AMC, for instance. For suitability for low resource settings, I think one key aspect will be not to just think about how can we get more vaccines onto the market, but also which ones are best suited for low resource settings, and prioritizing phase 2 candidates. I don't mean phase 2 in the sense of phase 2 clinical trials, but we have often seen now the first phase of vaccines, those likely to be approved in the coming year, described as phase 1 vaccines. And then there's the phase 2, the kind of vaccines that are lagging behind a little bit in research and development. I think it will be key to target and specifically select those that have the best suitability to low resource settings. And then also to engage in some follow-on research and development to improve the suitability of the first phase of vaccine candidates to these very settings. And finally, and I'll end on that note, on affordability, I think one important aspect is to try to get as close as possible to at-cost pricing, or at least cost plus some kind of pre-agreed auditable margin to creates a level of transparency that is also very important for improving access. And again, the scaling of up production and technology transfer to developing country vaccine manufacturers. All of these are options that I believe all different stakeholders can engage with, and something that can definitely feature in also funding agreements, be it from philanthropic organizations or public research organizations in future funds that flow into vaccine research and development. And with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Manuel, for that very thorough and concise overview. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought and a number of very specific options that we'll now dive a bit more deeply into discussing. So with that, I'd like to invite all of our panelists to come back onto the screen. Great. Okay, excellent. And I'll begin, let me kick off the panel with an initial question to Professor Kwon. We have heard a number of times coming from the public health community, in particular, the argument that nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Wearing your public health hat and representing the public health community, why is access to vaccines important to Korea? Why does the global distribution of vaccines matter to Korea?
Well, I really agree that the argument that no one is safe until everyone is safe, that is quite true, important message for the Koreans and Korean government, because Korea is a typical open economy. And open economy means it's not just the export. I mean, Samsung, Hyundai, they export a lot. So we can never lock down. We can never block the border and entry because that's the nature of the Korean economy. And often many Koreans have a misunderstanding that when we say open economy, they all think about Samsung, Hyundai, big global manufacturing business. But at the same time, in Korea, like agriculture, fishery, and the small business, we rely a lot on the workers from low-income countries. So when we, I mean, now in the COVID-19 situation, we didn't block the border, but there are a lot of reduced schedule of flights available from low-income countries, between Korea and low-income countries. So agriculture and fishery suffer a lot because the foreign workers cannot come to Korea. So because of this, of course, among experts, we view ODA really from a philanthropy and global public good perspective. But even for a very self-interest and industrial perspective of Korea as an open economy, we should have a clear understanding that this COVID can never be over until all the countries around the world is really safe from COVID-19. And although there is no perfect solution for COVID-19, but we know that the vaccines are the most reliable kind of a solution for COVID-19. So that is the kind of best hope. So in that sense, like Korea is an open economy and vaccine is so important, then the Korea and the Korean government really should contribute a lot to the vaccines of COVID-19. But compared to the previous issues of NTDs, in the case of NTDs, globally there is a lack of R&Ds because for a manufacturer's perspective, the market is not there for NTDs. But in the case of this COVID-19, one small good news is the market is there because huge patients from high-income countries. So that's why I think there are more and more manufacturers willing to do something. I mean, R&D and develop the vaccines for COVID-19, but they don't care about. Sorry to say this, but they don't care about low-income countries. They mainly still target high-income countries. So now you have a huge issue of how to make it available to low-income countries. Although we understand that even in the R&D domain, there are some what is the issue of this low-income country relevant R&Ds. So although it's a good news that the Korean government or the president declared that Korea should do something, but I hope we should go beyond that. We should go beyond the president declaration. I mean, Manuel, you gave very good examples at your last slide. Very good examples of the modalities of global collaboration from R&D, manufacturing, distribution, funding. But I'm not sure to what extent Korean government is committed to the details of the collaboration beyond the president declares something. So, and also I
think that's a perfect. Yes, please.
Sorry.
It's a perfect question to frame the remainder of the panel.
So we should really go beyond that. And also Koreans, I'm afraid, still the Korean government should change the paradigm of ODA. Still, Korea is increasing rapidly the amount of ODA budget, but the majority of Korean ODA is targeted bilateral project levels, in different countries. And I think it's a lack of understanding of the importance of supporting the global level R&D and global level support for the global public good issues. So Korean government or Korean ODA should shift gear toward more and more toward this global public good, rather than focusing more or less solely on these bilateral project levels. Over.
Thank you for reminding us not only about the public health imperative, but also the consequences for the economy and for the economic interests of people all across the socioeconomic spectrum, not only, of course, the wealthy, and laying out a very, very clear challenge to the authorities. You emphasized the role of public research and development, public funding. So I want to turn now to Dr. Kim, who of course leads a public research organization, and ask you, what do you think are the primary issues that may hinder equitable access to vaccines today? You have a long history in working in public research and development, and what would your advice be to the Korean government, Korean stakeholders, on what they should do to overcome some of these challenges?
I think, if I may share a slide.
Yes, please.
There's one in particular. Let's see. I think I've got it. There, actually 2 slides.
While we're getting those ready, let me just remind the audience, you can type your questions into the chat. Thank you.
All right. So this is actually an illustration of the vaccines that are currently in phase 2 or soon to enter, phase 3 or soon to enter phase 3. The ones with the yellow stars already have emergency use authorization. So those are Chinese and Russian vaccines. Of course, no proof of efficacy or safety at that point. But what the little circles tell you is when the trials first started, when the first data were available. Then the third circle is when advanced testing began, and the hatched bars indicate when production will occur. So a number of companies have already started to engage production. So we've moved very quickly. But I think, as Manuel pointed out, the real issue is not around moving quickly, because proving a vaccine worked is only the first step. I mean, and probably by the end of this year, November, December, January, we will have a number of companies announcing interim results from their trials that will, I hope, show safety and efficacy. But the bigger hurdles almost are the ones that are coming for the Korean government and for all governments, which are going to be around manufacturing sufficient quantity at sufficient quality, and then getting the vaccine used, because the vaccine itself is not, the vaccine is just the weapon to fight the war against COVID. But the long and difficult fight to overcome this pandemic is going to be fought on the ground by people delivering vaccine and people who are willing to take the vaccine. And the big issue that we see, and again, Manuel talked about this, is shown in this slide here from the Wall Street Journal. If you look at the left, those are the companies, the Western companies that are in the lead. If you look on the right, who's purchased or pre-ordered those doses? And you can see the high-income countries have bought or pre-ordered 4 billion doses of vaccine. The little black box warning at the bottom is some modeling from the Gates Foundation. If the high-income countries take the first 2 billion doses without equity and distribution, global COVID deaths will double. And it may mean then that the efficient control of this pandemic will be hindered because of inequity in distribution. And that is actually a major problem. And it actually has a basis in reality. Rotavirus vaccine, which is an amazingly good vaccine, resulted soon after its introduction in 2007, resulted in the near disappearance of rotavirus diarrhea in the United States. WHO approved and recommended the vaccine in 2009. 11 years later, 60% of the world's children still do not receive 3 doses of rotavirus vaccine. If this happens with COVID, and we are looking at a situation that modeling and our own experience tells us will unnecessarily prolong morbidity and increase mortality from COVID-19. The Korean government's commitment to global organizations like CEPI, like COVAX, and leadership in these areas, advocacy for the global solutions are going to be really critical. Korea also has to remember that it's not the only voice. As a high-income country, but a relatively small one, Korea has to find other voices that can act with it, that can create consensus around the need to support a global solution for the problem of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's really that idea that these countries can band together, that together now with China, which has joined COVAX, maybe we can be persuasive. Maybe we can put into place the funding, because COVAX still is short of funding, and the drive, the initiative to make sure that as vaccine gets rolled out, that there is not only equitable access to countries that are poor, but that we can convince some of the wealthier countries to take their allocation of COVAX vaccine, as the European Union has suggested, and give it to the countries that can't afford it. And this is the kind of thing that we will need to do, because people talk, and Manuel again mentioned this about the global race for the vaccine. This shouldn't be a race for the vaccine. This is a global effort to come up with a solution, and the ability to apply that solution globally will really be the measure of our response to this pandemic.
Thank you so much. I know that you need to leave us a bit early today, so I wanted to actually ask you for the one thing that IVI, as a publicly funded, as a public intergovernmental R&D organization, what can you do to ensure, in fact, this grand vision for globally equitable vaccines that you have, in fact, challenged the government to carry out?
So that's a good question. So IVI decided not to pursue its own vaccine. What we wanted to do was to help other groups, whether they're small companies or big companies, or academic organizations at universities, to move their vaccines forward. And if that meant IVI was going to be the lab test, the organization in Korea that was going to do laboratory testing for companies in Korea and companies outside Korea, or the group that you could come to if you wanted to do a clinical trial in a developing country. Maybe not South Africa, which is has a lot of research capability, but in Mozambique or Madagascar or Burkina Faso, we would like to take the vaccines and begin to use them in real world settings. So this gets to actually the final point, which is, I think, what do we do the day after efficacy? I mean, people have this idea, right? We're going to have efficacy sometime soon, but the day after efficacy, we need to be able to say we can make it. We have to be able to say we can distribute it equitably. But then there are a huge number of scientific questions, some of which have dramatic policy implications. And these are around, we rushed to get these vaccines tested. We weren't able to optimize the dose to maximize the ability of the vaccine to create these infection-fighting proteins called antibodies, or to extend the durability so that we don't need to dose people every year. And we hadn't had time to figure that out. So we need to do those experiments, and people have to start planning those now, because when the time comes, we'll be busy thinking of other things. The second point here is that we need something called a correlative protection, which is a lab test that allows us to shorten to decrease the amount of time that it takes to optimize things. And this is a lab test. It's a kind of scientific question, but it is really critical if we want to speed up the next generation of vaccines. And the final thing that I should talk about really is around effectiveness, because it's one thing to show that your vaccine has an efficacy of 60% in a randomized clinical trial where everyone is being followed exactly according to protocol. But in the real world, that's not what's going to happen. And each of the vaccines may be slightly different in their ability to generate what's called herd protection. And the effectiveness trials will tell us that. And herd protection is a key concept that will impact policy. And when you ask CEPI or the Gates Foundation, are you thinking about effectiveness? Are you thinking about herd immunity? What is it going to take in order to do this? We're not there yet. But the time when we may have to know is upon us. And we really need to start thinking about that. And so IVI has been advocating to start planning some of these effectiveness trials, to start thinking about herd immunity, to start thinking about long-term safety issues. Because again, these vaccines we've been testing for 6 months. We really need to know how they're going to behave safety-wise at 2 years and 3 years. And these are questions looking down the road. I mean, yes, keep our eyes on the prize. We need to have a vaccine. We need to show a vaccine works. That's fine. But after that, the real work is going to be using the vaccine, optimizing the vaccine, and making sure that we can get an efficient control over this pandemic.
I think you've highlighted for us very nicely a number of the big scientific challenges that will remain. If I may just clarify one last thing, which is given the heavy emphasis on access here, are there provisions, are there strings attached to some of the public money that you receive or that you spend when you're working in partnership with private firms that in fact ensure that there will be globally equitable access to the products that you are collaborating and developing?
So if the funding is coming from CEPI, there are definitely going to be global access agreements that are in place. So for instance, the work that we do with Inovio is funded by CEPI, and then we are a contractor of Inovio to do the work of the clinical trial here. The funding from Inovio, funding from CEPI to Inovio carries the typical global access agreement that CEPI negotiates. When we do contract work with companies, so it's a company coming to us to ask us to help them do this work, so we don't get a global access agreement there. The Korean government, though, in its funding for vaccine research and development, has an interest in testing these vaccines outside of Korea. And when that happens, countries will ask us, if not, we will prompt them to ask us about access. And many countries are interested in participating in clinical trials because it allows them to initiate this discussion, which is really critical. I mean, populations that volunteer for clinical trials should have access to safe and effective vaccines after the trials are over. And this is something that countries and companies need to commit to. In HIV vaccines, which is the field I was from, access agreements were an important part of starting a phase 3 trial in Thailand. The government of Thailand negotiated with both companies in advance for access after the trial, if the trial was successful. And those are the kinds of things that, Thailand had an experience where it didn't have access. So it learned from that and really moved this discussion forward. And so those of us at IVI who've been in global health for a while understand that access is a really key issue. And we aren't only testing vaccines in low and middle income countries. We're building capacity, and we're hopefully also building experience so that they know that these are the questions to ask as we are moving forward with the development of vaccine trials.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know you need to go and fight traffic, so we'll thank you and kindly, excuse me. Indeed, I think take up the challenge that you have laid down for the government. This is a very nice segue to our next speaker, who is, of course, Ambassador Lim. You've heard a lot of challenges from your colleagues here on the panel for what we expect or hope that the Korean government can do, both in terms of mobilizing political consensus at the international level beyond the Korean government's commitment alone. Could you share with us what are some of the concrete measures that the Korean government has adopted already to ensure equitable allocations of vaccines? What are some proposals that you've made for which you hope there will be a broader international support? Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Moon. I would like to thank the MSF for giving me opportunity to share what we are doing in terms of the response to COVID-19. First of all, I would like to begin by emphasizing that Korea fully supports the view the COVID-19 vaccines are the public goods for humanity, and equitable the access is essential. This point, as mentioned by previous speakers, are clearly stated and reaffirmed at the highest level by President Moon at the keynote speech at the World Health Organization Assembly in last May, and also again in UN General Assembly the last month. The second, I want to say that Korea is a believer and a strong supporter of multilateralism. At the moment, the COVAX facility is widely recognized as the mechanism, the platform, the framework. The COVAX facility is a widely the recognized one. And then this one is to ensure the COVID-19, the vaccines for all. The Korean government has been the active supporter of the COVAX facility from the beginning. Since its launch of the facility, Korea was among the first one to submit its intention of interest. Not only just joining the facility, but also participating in the group of friends of the COVAX facility initiated by the Switzerland and Singapore. The Korea has also played a role of expanding support and gathering solidarity for the facility. For example, we made a joint statement together with the UK, Singapore, Australia, and others, which emphasize the equitable and fair allocation of vaccines at the recent WHO Executive Board meeting. Korea is also reviewing the possibility of supporting the AMC Advance the market commitment, which aims to distribute the vaccines to the low and the middle income countries. Thirdly, I would like to touch upon the access to COVID-19 tools accelerator, the so-called ACT-A. ACT-A is the umbrella mechanism encompassing the COVAX facility, which also covers therapeutics and diagnostics. Recently, Korea joined the ACT-A Facilitation Council. Facilitation Council is a major problem solving the vision setting the body of ACT-A, the mechanisms. And to this council, the Korea was invited as a market shaper in recognition of the outstanding diagnostic capacity of its private enterprises, as well as the government contribution in general. I recommend the participants to find and look at the video clip of the high-level side event convened by UN Secretary General at the end of last month in the margin of the UN General Assembly, where the Korea was invited as a main speaker. And last but not least, I would like to bring your attention to G4IDR, support group for infectious disease response, launched by Korea in May this year in an effort to reinforce the governance of the infectious disease response. G4IDR is a Geneva-based group of like-minded countries, which intends to share the experiences of COVID-19 response and strengthen the multilateral cooperation system relating to infectious disease. G4IDR currently consists of 8 core members, including Korea, Singapore, Turkey, Mexico, the UAE, Morocco, Kenya, and Peru, considering geographical representations across the continent. And additional 15 countries, including the EU, Canada, Australia, Japan, are joining as participating countries. This is the good example mentioned by Dr. Kim in the previous the interventions. Since its inception, G4IDR has adapted a joint the vision and terms of reference, discussed ways to improve the international health regulations, IHR, and delivered a joint statement on its activities and prospective plans at the session of WHO Executive Board. G4IDR will focus on special session on the taking substantive the actions that can bring about enhanced governance. Through the G4IDR activities, Korea looks forward to playing its part in finding effective and efficient response measures for future pandemics. Let me stop here.
Thank you so much. It's clear that the government has engaged and supported a wide range of initiatives, and I wanted to just follow up very briefly on the G4IDR group, which has now, I think, certainly expanded far beyond its original sphere of influence. A number of these are middle-income countries, a number of them are high-income countries. It's a difficult challenge for any political leader to say, we will support another country getting access to vaccine before we cover 100% of our own population. We have not seen very many countries actually making those kinds of commitments. And yet we know that with the limitations and the total volume of supply that will be available next year, that if countries that have the means do not in fact give up some of that, some of the resources that they have, we will not reach equitable coverage in 2021. I'm wondering, to what extent is there an appetite within the G4IDR group or within the wealthier countries that you're speaking with to in fact do that, to say we will only cover some of our population? As Dr. Tedros has said, it's better to have some people vaccinated in all countries rather than all people in some countries. Is there political appetite for that? Is there leadership for that?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I have to say that the expectation on the role of the Korea in response to COVID-19 is getting increased. As a diplomat based in Geneva, we are getting such a feeling, increasing every day. Actually, the G4IDR is not only the response to the COVID-19 only, it's beyond the COVID-19. One of the background we wanted this G4IDR initiative is that the growing the recognition of the very good record of the Korean government to the response of the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, as the speakers mentioned, Korea case is one of the few the best practices in the world that has been successfully managing the pandemic without a single nationwide lockdown so far. This has been well noted and recognized worldwide. In addition, Korea is currently a member of the WHO Executive Board as one of the major donor countries to WHO, as well as other international health institutions such as IVI, Gavi, the Global Fund, and UNITED. In this sense, G4IDR is a sense of a response of Korea to the world, which they anticipate more effective and well-functioning global health governance against the current and future pandemics. To the response of the COVID-19, the G4IDR as a group, we made the joint statement in the last WHO, the executive, the board meetings, emphasizing that the public goods of the vaccine as equitable the access to the vaccines. But we are not emphasizing only the vaccines, we are emphasizing also the therapeutics and then the diagnostics and then the governance itself. So actually the Korea has moved forward with the lessons learned from its fight with MERS in 2015. We considered MERS crisis as an opportunity to strengthen our health system. As a result, this experience became a valuable asset for Korea to respond and control the current pandemic. We want that through the G4IDR, we would like to galvanize the lessons learned and deliver a similar outcome. Throughout the various activities, we will share our experiences and lessons learned with international community and contribute to strengthening the global health governance in preparation for the future pandemics. As a group, I can say that we will continue to engage in the global discourse in this direction through joint statement, submitting suggestions, and communicating with the major WHO bodies, such as Independent Panel of Preparedness and the Response, International Health Regulation Review Committee, among others. Also, we plan to organize roundtables to raise awareness and identify specific actions to strengthen multilateral cooperation in vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics for the aim of leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's clear that this is certainly not only an economic or a scientific issue, but very much also a global political issue requiring support from the highest levels of government, and it's very encouraging to see that. Let me turn, last but not least, to Dr. Jinmun Yoon. You have heard a lot of, I think, expectations, demands on the industry, on the pharmaceutical industry, in terms of the role that it can play, it should play in terms of ensuring global access to an equitable vaccine. As the vice president of a company that is developing the vaccine that is at the most advanced stage of development in Korea right now, it would be very interesting to hear your views on what can Genexine do to ensure that your product is available internationally, and to hear a little bit about the internal thinking. Was this a purely commercial opportunity for you? Were there other reasons why Genexine decided to engage in R&D? And are some of these expectations, these broad public expectations for access, are these things that your company can meet? So over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to answer the second question first. And we have clear reason for the engage in this vaccine development. The first, we have three reasons. The first is Genexine's R&D has been supported by a Korean government with research grants. In other words, the Korean taxpayers, Korean people, raised the present Genexine. So therefore, in such a pandemic crisis, it is our responsibility to return our vaccine technology to our society. So this is consistent with our spirit, and we believe that this is the reason why we exist here. And the second, there are many advantages of plasmid DNA vaccine. Among them, the speedy development and the relative higher stability and safety made DNA vaccine suitable for COVID-19 situation. And third, Genexine has been developing various DNA vaccines for infectious pathogens such as HIV, HPV, and HCV, tuberculosis, and so on. Through preclinical and clinical trials, although most of them with failures, we have accumulated many experiences and lessons. Recently, we have finally achieved our DNA vaccine therapeutic efficacy in HPV positive cervical cancer patients. This is the achievement that we have waited for a long time. It was selected as a BioChallenger project by Korean MFDS. So with this success story, we decided to participate in overcoming COVID-19 situation by applying our DNA vaccine's benefit. And the challenges after our R&D succeed, to make our vaccines reach the global population, that's the situation that we expect in near future. So far, we have manufactured the DNA vaccine for clinical trial in a CMO because we do not have a manufacturing facility. That is a contract manufacturing organization, CMO, but for real vaccination after vaccine approval, we need a really big scale of vaccine production. Because we do not have a manufacturing facility, we are considering domestic and global CMO for large-scale vaccine production. They have 20,000 liter scale microbial fermenters, and they will be able to produce 100 million doses per year. So by utilizing these CMOs, we will be able to produce huge amount of vaccines for a global population. However, one more important thing before doing this, we need a purchase guarantee from the government because the budget for this scale is way, way far beyond our budget capability. So if the above requirements are satisfied, we are more than willing to participate in COVAX program. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you very clearly highlighted the hybrid of private technology, private sector capacity combined with public money, with a public direction that is provided to the research and public support politically for the research that you're doing that is really essential to, in fact, progress the research on your vaccine candidate. I was wondering to what extent you envision production sites taking place in a number of different countries around the world. Technology transfer and sharing of intellectual property, data, know-how has been put on the table, I think, a number of times. And what we've seen with other companies is that there's a real spectrum, I would say, of approaches. We have some companies like AstraZeneca that have engaged already in tech transfer, in multiple places around the world. Then you have other companies like Moderna that have not committed yet, at least to doing that. And I don't mean to accuse or name specific companies, but we do see a really broad range. So where is Genexine there? Is this something that you think could be part of the plan?
Yes, we are still considering the plan because we are still on the phase 1 study, and we will be able to finish the phase 2A early next year, and then to start the phase 2 the first half of the next year. Then that is a time that we need to start the large-scale vaccine production. So we are considering our domestic CMO. They have 20,000 liter scale that is corresponds to 100 million doses per year. So in addition to the global CMOs, we can expand our capability for this distribution. So still in the plan.
Indeed, it is a big challenge to at the earliest and riskiest stages of development, indeed, to make commitments all the way down the line in a process that might be, of course, we don't know yet whether the vaccine will succeed, but we wish you the best of luck and hope that the vaccine can indeed be made widely available. In the interest of time, and I've done a terrible job of keeping time, so I apologize for that, I wanted to actually turn back to each of our panelists for your closing conclusions. If there's one thing that your own organization can do, whether it's academia, whether it's government, whether it's industry, civil society, what is the one thing that you can do to make any COVID vaccine truly a people's vaccine? And is there one ask that you would make of another panelist here? And with that, we'll try to wrap up right on time. So let me begin. Perhaps we can go in reverse order. We'll start with Dr. Yoon, Ambassador Lim, Professor Kwan, and then Dr. Martin before we close. So Dr. Yoon, back to you.
Okay. So the single most important thing for our company is to make a good vaccine and manufacture them at a sufficient quantity, I think. And then this situation reminds me of the past program that the WHO's influenza vaccine technology transfer project to developing countries to be ready for the future influenza pandemic. The vaccine companies, including us, developed vaccine manufacturing technologies, and we were more than willing to share our technology by transferring to developing countries. The WHO contributed to distribution of those technologies at the time, and I believe this is the typical example of how we better respond to the global pandemic crisis together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very clear and concise. Ambassador Lim, over to you.
Thank you. I can say that the cooperation, solidarity, and working with other states and relevant international organizations are the keys to ensure that mechanisms such as COVAX, the facility, and the ACTA they work properly. In this regard, Korea is going to continue to advocate the importance of the issues. In this process, we think that we need to work together because we cannot work alone. We need to work together with civil society and the academia. Thank you very much. That's the important area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Kwon?
Yes, although today our discussions are focusing on the access to COVID-19 vaccines, but this is closely related with the very important issue of global access to medicines or essential medicines worldwide. So I really hope that this global coordination in this vaccine area is the beginning of a continued, real collaboration globally among countries. For example, how to change the reward system for the R&D in the pharma industry, how to share information to improve the pricing transparency. Unfortunately, globally, we have had a terrible track record in this collaboration. We talk a lot, but the track record is very bad. So I hope that this collaboration for COVID vaccine is successful, and then there's a continued collaboration globally on the overall, on the access to medicines globally overall. Over.
Thank you. And I think you highlighted with your comments the important role of scholars, of academics, and also participating very actively in these debates and pushing our own governments and our own industries, in fact, in the right direction, let's say. Last but not least, Manuel, over to you.
Thank you, Suri. So obviously at the Access campaign, we will continue to advocate on a whole bunch of range of access issues. But if I had to pick one, it would be continuing to advocate to stakeholders to think beyond the most immediate short term. Short-termism is in a certain kind of way what got us into this trouble in the first place. And think about building a public health oriented emerging infectious disease R&D landscape in the long term, already focusing on the post-COVID landscape.
Thank you so much. And what we are seeing in the COVID pandemic is not only, of course, setting the path for how international relations will evolve in the coming years and decades, but also how the way we think about research and development of health technologies, of who should get access and who should benefit from advances in science and technology, how will those debates evolve in the coming years? And I think that our experience with the COVID vaccine will in fact set the scene for that. And hopefully that will be a positive experience. Hopefully it will be something that we're all proud to look back on 10, 20 years from now when we tell our kids and grandchildren about what we did in this pandemic. If I could just pull out 2 or 3 key themes from the overall debate before we close. I think the first is really about interdependence between countries. I think we heard, for example, very clearly from Professor Kwon how important getting access to a vaccine is not only for people within Korea, but it's important, of course, that those vaccines are made accessible to everybody worldwide. It's a question of national self-interest for the economy, and it's a question of global justice and global equity. And we also heard from Dr. Kim that in fact the research and development for the Korean vaccines, I should say, there's not only one, also depends, of course, on being able to do clinical trials in other countries, right? In order to advance the development of any vaccine, countries that have actually gotten the pandemic under control, as South Korea has, in fact, do rely very heavily on other countries to advance the clinical development and the demonstration of safety and efficacy. So there is really, I think, a very strong theme of interdependence. I think that the second key theme I would like to highlight is that raised by Ambassador Lim in terms of the need to build global political consensus, to have political leadership to bring a number of countries on board to contribute very concretely to what is really a noble and important and critical mission to ensure that everybody can get access to vaccines. Last but not least, I wanted to highlight, I think, the theme that Dr. Yoon brought up very nicely, which is at the end of the day, this is a public and private mixed initiative. It's not going to be solved by one sector alone. It requires, again, collaboration within and beyond one country alone. So on that note, let me close this webinar by thanking each of our very illustrious speakers for all of your thoughtful insights, for helping the world to understand better what are the contributions from Korea towards ending this global pandemic. And let me thank in particular MSF Korea and Shineha in particular, and the big team she has behind her who made this webinar possible. So on that note, have a good evening, afternoon, and day.